Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it's the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down and put the good into baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all this? The disciples answered, Yes. And he said to them, Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household, who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. This is the good news of the gospel for us today. I invite you to please be seated. So if God invited you to ask for anything in the world, what would you ask to have? Now I realize we're in church, so automatically many of you went straight to the Sunday school answers. But if you really thought about it, if you weren't in this context right now, what would you really ask for? There was an elderly mountain woman speaking at her church about prayer. The woman explained that it had been about 50 years since her parents had died. She lived in the mountains on her own. She saw the other women around her getting married and having families, and she really felt like she was missing out, and she was lonely. So she had started to pray. She prayed that God would pick out a husband for her someday. She prayed and she prayed and she prayed, confident that the Lord would answer her prayer and find her a husband. Now, as she was speaking, one of the women in her circle spoke up and she said, But Nettie, you're still single. Isn't that amazing, she answered. Somewhere out there is a 74-year-old man who has been resisting God's will for 50 years. We do that, don't we? There are times when we actually think that we're going to completely manipulate God's will and bend it to our own. And then we forget that part that Jesus taught about prayer that says that we're supposed to pray that God's will would be done, not necessarily our own. In reality, there would be some among us whose prayers would be that God's will would change in some way, that somehow we might get a special exemption or an accommodation for just ourselves. You know, I've often talked about many of the characters we meet throughout Scripture, men and women who are flawed and broken and in need of God's grace, and who manage somehow to find a unique place in God's plan despite their shortcomings. But today we have a story about one of those winning moments, a time when someone got it right. Shortly after Solomon took over the reign of Israel after the death of his father David, God came to him in a dream, and he asked him what he wanted. And Solomon's prayer wasn't for anything for himself. It wasn't for power, it wasn't for wealth, but instead, Solomon offered a magnificent prayer and request. He prayed for wisdom. He prayed for discernment. He prayed for understanding as he governed and as he led. He prayed for one tool that would benefit all of the people for whom he was responsible. How brilliant. This prayer alone suggests that Solomon probably already possessed great wisdom, enough to know that he needed more. That's remarkable. Now, I know there's a part of us that feels like it's not quite right to pray for ourselves. We'd rather pray for a situation, or we'd rather pray even for just someone else. But we're not always comfortable praying for our own well-being. But I think that's something that we can learn from this story. God's okay with us making requests on our own behalf, as long as those requests are born out of a desire to serve God by serving others. For example, I'm not sure that God cares who wins the Super Bowl or even the World Series. I don't think that God enables his favorite driver to win the Daytona 500, and I'm most certain that God doesn't have a preferred candidate to win on Survivor or The Amazing Race. But I do think that God cares when his children are seeking ways to build the kingdom with the gifts they're given. And that can happen in any of those contexts, as well as the contexts in which we live our lives. It was a few years ago. I went to the National Youth Workers Convention in Cincinnati, Ohio. I went with Sherry Berg, Mike Odegaard, Chris Opegard. And the Friday night of the convention was really going to be a dream night for me. First, we were going to eat supper at Skyline Chili, which is one of my must-dos whenever I'm in Cincinnati. And then Donald Miller, who's a fantastic author, was going to be the main speaker at the evening assembly. I was really excited for it. Well, apparently no one bothered to tell the staff at Skyline that night that I was coming. Neither did they tell them that there might be several hundred other youth ministry types coming. And so this little tiny restaurant in downtown Cincinnati was absolutely packed to the gills, beyond overflowing. There was a line waiting outside, and the staff just was completely overwhelmed. So when we did finally get a table and when our server came over, I told her I was going to pretend to be having a tough time making a decision, even though I knew exactly what I wanted, just so she could take a moment to catch her breath. And I said, "You weren't ready for a crowd, were you?" And she said, "No." Well, we gave our orders, and Mike excused himself to use the restroom. He came back. He leaned over and he said, "Hey, they have the same kind of dishwasher that we had when I was back at camp." "Oh, really? Cool." "So?" "They have a big stack of dishes back on the counter back there. Let's go." "Seriously?" "Yeah, let's go." If you know Mike, you know Mike's enthusiasm for service, and so back we went. Mike and I started washing dishes, scraping, scrubbing, occasionally chipping away at chili and cheese debris that had been sitting for quite some time and was packed several inches deep, several feet long. In time, Chris and Sherry came back so that Mike and I could go eat. The four of us spent the next several hours in that dish room until all the dishes were clean, till the entire restaurant was empty. The staff was very appreciative. They thanked us, they comped our meal for us, which was nice. They even gave us souvenir basketballs from the Xavier University of Cincinnati basketball game that was coming up. We missed Donald Miller that night. By the time we were done, it was time just to head back to the hotel. But it was one of my favorite convention nights ever. And the best part was it wasn't over yet. A couple days later, we decided to stop by that same Skyline for lunch before we left for the airport. One of the managers from Friday night was there. And so when we were seated, she came over, she thanked us again, and we said, "Hey, it was no big deal, it was a lot of fun, and I learned how to use the dishwasher." And then she told us the rest of the story. She said, "Do you remember last Friday that boy that was in here?" I said, "Yeah, I remember him. He was helping out, he was working here." And she said, "Well, that was my son. And, well, here's the thing. He asked who you were after you left." And I said, "Well, they're here with some Christian convention for something." And he said, "Huh. I guess I didn't know that Christians would do something like that." And she went on to say, he hasn't been to church in years. But he thought, if Christians are really like that, maybe I ought to give it another try. So she said today he went to church. And that was the best part of that story. See, God's kingdom grew that weekend because Mike knew how to use a dishwasher. Just that simple. Sometimes, in order for God's kingdom to grow, we just need to take stock of the simple gifts we have and realize that just using those can impact other people. That's why Jesus taught in parables and symbols like the ones we have in today's gospel reading. Seeds, yeast, pearls, fish, grass, all of these are very, very simple things that can help point to God's infinite kingdom. the infinite truths of God's work in the world can be revealed in the most basic of things. Small seeds grow into great things, just as small acts of kindness and welcome can make worlds of difference. The group who served in West Virginia last week worshiped at Willow Creek Community Church in South Barrington, Illinois, last Sunday. It's a congregation of tens of thousands of members. They have their own softball league, much less team. And we were going to attend their most popular service, their 11:15 service. We were going to be among several thousand people who would gather in their auditorium. But I'll tell you, I was personally greeted by several folks. There was a greeter at the main door. There was a person at their information desk. There was a hospitality person who was working in the cafeteria who was asking if we'd been there before and did we know, how and when the kitchen would be open. There was an usher in our section. Several members of the congregation came up and introduced themselves to me and welcomed me. Said, I don't know if you've been here or not, but I haven't met you. What a great ministry. A place that really is very, very large was made to feel actually very, very small in a very short time, thanks to the hospitality shared by the folks who were there. I complimented one of them on their ability to welcome guests. It was one of the custodians, actually, who was cleaning the bathroom after, as we were leaving. And he said, we take a lot of pride in how we welcome people. But then he was very quick to add, but not too much pride, because you know how that can be. So a little bit ago, I invited you to be a part of our greeter and hospitality ministry. And when we do that, it's not just so that we can fill a spot, whether it's standing at the doors, the information desk, serving coffee and donuts. It's not just to fill a line on a sheet, but we're inviting you to be a part of something big, something very important to Trinity's ministry, because we don't know who's going to come through the doors on any given Sunday. Hopefully, if you're a visitor this week, somebody introduced themselves to you and welcomed you. Hopefully, you'll think about being a part of that ministry, because when you do that, you are playing a part in God's kingdom right where you are. And it can be something as simple as extending a hand and smiling and welcoming someone to Trinity. Throughout his ministry, Jesus taught that small things can be of great value, world-changing even. If we aren't able to perceive God's little graces throughout the day, like I was showing with the kids, our world would be pretty bleak indeed. We would miss glimpses of God's kingdom right in front of us. And when we don't share those gifts, well, we deprive other people of that same opportunity, and that would be a shame. If it weren't for our ability to recognize those small gifts of tremendous value, we would certainly live without hope. In the same way, we need to recognize that we're also of great value in God's kingdom. You are of great value. God gave all that he has, his only Son, in order that we all might be rescued from those lives of hopelessness and despair. So don't sell yourself short. You are a priceless treasure in God's kingdom. Don't underestimate your capacity for making a difference. Wherever you are in life, with whatever gifts you have, you are capable of changing this world with the gifts that God's given to you. Skills, qualities, talents, relationships, experiences, all of these things are gifts to be used in service to God. So don't underestimate the difference that you can make. Your small gesture might make a world of difference to someone. Don't underestimate how those little things can impact God's kingdom. So maybe instead of offering those prayers that God would change the world and all the things that seem out of control and beyond our capacity, may our prayers be, at least on occasion, for ourselves, that God would grant us the vision to use the gifts we have to build his kingdom right here, right now, right where we are. Amen.